All right. Well, hey, welcome to another 10 at 10. This morning, I got my whiteboard out again, and we're going to talk through all things spiritual gifts. I think this is one of the most important questions, certainly one of the questions I get asked most often. Not as much what is a spiritual gift, but especially how can I identify my spiritual gifts? And so I think if we want to know what a spiritual gift is, just some passages to sort of give you that I think are really, really helpful as we think through this. Romans 12, 4 through 8, and then 1 Corinthians 12. Interesting that they're both chapter 12, 4 through 11. Those are sort of the two kind of big, famous sort of passages on what spiritual gifts are. And then one other one that's kind of short that a lot of people sort of seem to forget. And I'm going to post a video from John Piper that I think is really, really helpful, where he does kind of a similar thing that I'm doing, but much better. And looking at a look at the book as he kind of digs into First Peter 4:10. But First Peter 4:10 tells us something really helpful about spiritual gifts. It says, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. And so I just want to recognize here as we're talking about this is that all of God's people have a gift, as each has received a gift. And I think that's really important to remember, that no matter who you are, if you're a part of our church, for instance, at Rock Point, that means you're here for a reason, and that God intends to use you and have you serve his people in a really specific way. And in fact, that God has gifted you by the Spirit to be able to serve, to have an unusual effectiveness, is what J.D. Greer says a spiritual gift is, an area in which we have an unusual effectiveness as we serve God's people. All of us have been gifted, and gifted differently, to serve the people of God. And Greg Allison reminds us that that is both for the maturity of God's people, that we would grow deeper as God's people, but also for the mission of God's people, that more and more would come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And so just a couple real key points to remember about spiritual gifts. We all are empowered by the Spirit. If you are a Christian, you are empowered by the Spirit. You have a spiritual gift. And if you are a part of a local church, which I pray that you are, it's so necessary for every Christian to be an active participant in a local church. Well, that means that God has placed you there for a reason, and that he has gifted you in a particular way to serve that local body of the church, both its maturity or its discipleship, and also its mission as it seeks to reach the local community, the nation, and the world for Jesus Christ. And so I think that's helpful, but I want to get to the question of how do we identify our spiritual gifts? Now, I know that probably the way that most of us have heard is through doing like a spiritual gifts inventory or an assessment. And I'm going to link one of these in the profile that I think is helpful. But I just want to say from the outset, I think this is a good starting point. But I think it really lacks it's not the most vital. In fact, I think you could never take an inventory and still I'm very confident that you could definitely identify your spiritual gift and identify it well without ever having taken one. But still, I think they're helpful. And here's why I think they're helpful. I do think it kind of helps you think in the realm of what it means to serve other people and all the different ways that you might serve and be gifted to serve. And so I think that's really helpful to kind of do that, to get your mind thinking in those ways, and to maybe even give you some categories or some areas that you think, well, that might be where I'm gifted. Now, here's why I think it can be problematic, is that ultimately sometimes it can just turn into a personality test where you're just kind of checking off what you want to be. You know, that's one of the problems that we see in these sorts of inventories, is that often we sort of check the boxes that we most aspire to, but maybe aren't really identifying who we are best. See, the truth of the matter is we actually don't know ourselves best. It's one of the greatest lies in our culture, that in fact, oftentimes other people know us better than even we know ourselves. We don't always view ourselves exactly as who we are. We sort of have an idealized version too often. Or sometimes that can be flipped. Sometimes we have too negative a version. And so we just think, well, that can't be it. I'm not good at that. And we just go through that and we almost check nothing as we go through. And so sometimes that can be a problem. The second place is sometimes people will fill out an assessment like that and they'll think, well, this is where I'm gifted to serve and it's the only place I should serve. Well, that is, if you watch Piper's video on 1 Peter 4:10, he reminds us that the gifts that we've been given by the Spirit, they're not always like full, whole life sort of gifts. Sometimes they're giftings right in the middle of a situation we're in. I often, when I'm doing membership classes, I'll remind people that we sort of have these, if you wanted to say that your sort of passions, maybe even if you wanted to put gifts on one side and then the church's needs on the other side, our goal is that we would get here, right? We want your passions, your gifts to meet with our need. And then that's where you'll be most effective and most encouraged and satisfied when you're serving. But I always remind people that sometimes we just have a need. And you may not have a gift or a passion, but we have a need and we need people to serve in this area. And that's what it means to have a servant's heart, to be willing to serve wherever you're needed. Oftentimes some of honestly probably the most kind of beneficial, most encouraging times in my ministry have been when I have gone to do something that I have no gifting for, or at least felt like I had no gifting for. And honestly, it was a struggle. It was hard. And just praying to God, saying, Father, I need your Spirit to gift me in this time. Help me, give me wisdom, give me understanding, use me. And just, it's in our weakness, right? And God just showed up so faithfully. Those are some of the times where people will tell me, man, God used you in such a powerful way. And I'm like, seriously? Like, I couldn't even believe that. So often, even in our weaknesses, the areas where maybe we don't think we're most gifted or we don't have the most sort of excitement, sometimes God will really use us in that. And that just reminds us constantly that the most important thing about our serving is that it's a way in which we love God and love one another. And so that is so key. Now I want to talk to us a little bit. If the assessments and the inventories are maybe a good starting point, but they're not the most helpful way to identify our spiritual gifts, what is? And I would say that I've got sort of three things that I think you ought to do. And I'm going to move through these quickly, and then I'll kind of summarize them in a little diagram from J.D. Greer. But first, you just need to get busy serving. The best way to figure out your spiritual gift is to get serving. I love what Tom Schreiner says. Tom Schreiner says, he says, but knowing your spiritual gift isn't as important as exercising your spiritual gift. If you aren't sure what your spiritual gifts are, I wouldn't worry about it. If you give yourself to other believers in the church, you will inevitably be using your gifts. So my first encouragement would be just get busy serving. And as you serve, you'll begin to see those areas that most excite you. You'll begin to see the areas in which you have, where you're most effective, where it seems like God has most gifted you to serve. But the key thing is just get active, get busy serving. And then secondly, in the context of a local church, put yourself in situations where you've got other ministry leaders above you that are watching you and shepherding you and guiding you so that they can speak into your lives. We as people thrive in community. We know this especially in these days, right? As we don't get to gather as often. And so we were never intended to discover, to grow, or to employ our spiritual gifts in isolation. We need each other. We're going to talk about that in just a second. And then finally, so we want to get busy serving in the context of a local church, in community where other people can sort of speak and say, yes, that is, man, God is using you in that area. And that's such a gift. I see that. Hey, this might help you a little bit, where they can train us and teach us and equip us. And then finally, in light of who God has created you to be. Right? And light, recognizing that God has uniquely created you and uniquely gifted you, and probably in a way that he has created and gifted no one else in some sense. Who you are is unique. And so we need to kind of identify these gifts by serving in the context of a local church in light of who we are.
who God has created us to be. And so I love this diagram that J.D. Greer uses. He has sort of these kind of three circles. That's kind of a terrible circle. Let me draw that a little bit bigger here. He's got these three kind of circles. I get that somewhat. Yeah, it's decent. It's not the best drawing as you might imagine, but affinity is one. So he kind of thinks through finding your spiritual gift, especially in this area, then affirmation, and then ability. And as you're thinking through this, what he's looking for then is this little inner circle here, which we would say is the spiritual gift. And again, recognizing that this is something God does. It's not a science. He's gifting us in the moment, all of those things. But if we're just thinking generally how God has created us and gifted us to serve most often, then this is, I think, really helpful. And when we think of affinity, you're just thinking passion and desire, right? What are you most passionate about? What excites you? What desires do you have? Like, what do you love? What areas and things do you love to do and you love to serve? Those sorts of things. That's your affinity. That's your passions and your desires. Abilities, as you might imagine, are skills, right? Or talents. You know, there are things that come natural to you, right? As you think through that, these are things that I have skills in, that I have talents that come kind of easy to me. And they're in the areas, we're looking for the areas where both the affinity and the ability overlap. And then finally, affirmation. And this is so key to us because there's, just watch an episode of American Idol or something like that and recognize how many people think they're incredible singers and yet just aren't. Sometimes we don't see ourselves that clearly. And so affirmation is just how we've been encouraged by other people, right? As we think through this, how have they encouraged us and affirmed us? How have they testified to the gifts that we have? And so if I just speak for myself, I would say that one of the gifts that I think God has given me is teaching. And so I have an affinity. I love it. It's a passion and a desire of mine. It's one of my favorite things to do is to teach. I think I have some skills and talents in that area. It's something that comes relatively easy to me. I enjoy speaking in front of people. I've done it often. I love reading and studying and those sorts of things. And so I think there's just some natural abilities there that I have. And then I've often been affirmed in this area. Really since I was honestly in like elementary school even, but certainly in middle school and high school and college, people have just said, man, God really used you as you taught this, or Jeff, I really think this is a gift that God has given you. But I should say this, I've always sort of seen myself as a teacher, but never as a preacher. Never took a preaching class. I never really thought I would be preaching on Sunday mornings. I never saw that as a gifting. I enjoyed it once I got some opportunities to do it. I think there are some skills there, speaking in front of people and kind of logically and thinking through some things like that, ordering kind of a sermon together. But it wasn't until the affirmation piece came in. It wasn't until people started saying, Jeff, I really think you ought to preach, or I think this could be a gift for you. And I'm still sort of figuring this out a little bit even. But I just want to say that is sometimes this is why I think the context of the local church is so important. Sometimes you won't think you have a gift. Think, I don't think I'll ever do. I mean, I never thought I would preach, even somewhat consistently until people came around me, the local church pastors and others in the church would come and say, Jeff, I think you ought to do this. I think you might have a gift there. And so I think this is a little bit of how we ought to sort of ascertain what our spiritual gifts are. And then the last thing that I would just say on here that's not here, but is so important that I think we need to think through is our experiences or our story. I think that is so significant to how we think through this is our stories, what we've been through in life it's shaped us and influenced us in very significant ways. And I really do believe that God, as God brings us through different things, he intends to use that those experiences for his glory and the good of his people. And so I think that as we think of areas that we serve and maybe even giftings, there might be some giftings in which we have some affinities and abilities and affirmations, but in light of our story, in light of what we've been through, in light of our experiences, we might even be more kind of able or apt or have even more effectiveness in an area of service because of what we've been through. And so I would just encourage you that J.D. Greear says this: God writes each of our life stories in unique ways so that we can testify about him to others. But again, at the very end of this, and I think this is helpful. So if you want to know what is my spiritual gift or how has God gifted me to serve, I would say get busy serving, right? Do so in the context of a local church, and then do so in light of who God has created you to be. Think through your affinities, your abilities, and how the local church has affirmed you and what God has brought you through your experiences and your stories. And I think you'll be able to kind of start to begin to see how God intends to use you for the good of his people. And so I just want to finish with this quote. I love it. J.D. Greear says this: God steers pedaling bicycles. He's the rudder for moving ships. If you and I will get moving in obedience, he will steer us into our special giftings. Ultimately, I just encourage you to get busy serving and then trust God that he'll figure out the rest. Right? Think through all of these things, but if I could sum it up, most important, start pedaling, right? You're trying to, Carson's, he's known how to ride a bike now for about a couple of years, but still, if he gets slow or he takes too tight of a turn, he has to slow down. That's when he falls. The way to stay and to move and to do things is to pedal. And honestly, the way we taught him how to ride a bike is I said, hey, buddy, I'm going to let go and you just pedal as hard as you can. Because I knew that the more he pedaled, the easier it would be to balance, to steer, and to move. I think that's true. A great illustration for this situation as well as we think through our spiritual gifts. So hopefully this is helpful. I'd love to hear any questions that you have. I'll try to link some helpful resources on this as well. But thanks for joining me. Praying for you guys. Love you guys. Miss you guys as we continue to kind of live in these different days, but just longing for the day when we get to gather together. So thanks, guys, so much.